In the history of modern soccer, few names have defined an entire era the way Xavi Hernández has. He was the heart of Barcelona during the club's greatest period, the center of the tiki-taka style that changed how the world understood soccer. With Barcelona, Xavi won 8 La Liga titles, 4 UEFA Champions League titles, along with a whole series of other major and minor trophies, helping build one of the teams considered the greatest of all time. In the Spain national team jersey, he was the soul of an unprecedented golden era, winning Euro 2008, the World Cup 2010, and Euro 2012, 3 consecutive major titles that no national team had ever achieved before. Individually, Xavi was honored as the best player of Euro 2008, made the FIFA FIFPro World Divine and UEFA Team of the Year multiple times, and consistently finished in the top 3 for the FIFA Ballon d'Or during a fiercely competitive period against Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. But those numbers still can't fully tell the story of his influence. Xavi didn't just win titles, he redefined the role of a midfielder, turned passing into an art form, and turned controlling the game into an invisible form of power that the whole world had to learn from. But behind all that glory was a quiet, enduring journey that few people truly saw. Xavi wasn't the type of player that crowds easily fall in love with. He didn't have the speed for spectacular bursts, didn't have the strength to overpower opponents, and didn't score the kinds of goals that make entire stadiums explode. In a world that celebrates dazzling moments, Xavi existed in the details that only those who really understand soccer could notice. He had to accept standing in the shadow of more famous teammates, had to hear doubts about himself just passing sideways, had to bear the pressure of near perfection where even the tiniest mistake wasn't allowed. There were matches where he touched the ball more than 100 times, controlled the entire tempo, but when it ended, his name didn't appear in any headlines, and it was precisely in that silence that Xavi's will was forged. He didn't fight to be noticed. He fought to make the game work the right way. Without needing immediate recognition or praise, Xavi persistently pursued the kind of soccer he believed was right, a quiet but steadfast belief that allowed him not only to survive but to change the entire world. Even though most of the world only realized it after everything had already passed. If the story of this genius misunderstood by the whole world makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart emoji to help spread the value of quiet figures like Xavi. Born in the town of Terrassa in the Catalonia region, where soccer is not just a sport but a part of identity, Xavi Hernández came to the ball in a very natural way, as if it was something that had already been flowing in his blood long before he could even understand the world around him. His father, Joaquim Hernández, was also a soccer player, not a big star, but enough to pass on to the young Xavi a deep and almost absolute love for the game. In that small house, amid stories about tactics and matches analyzed down to every detail, Xavi grew up not just as a kid playing ball, but as someone learning to understand the game from the inside. But no matter how strong that love was, it could not hide a truth that the soccer world at the time kept reminding him of. This boy was too small, too slow, too weak to survive. When he joined La Masia, Barcelona's famous academy that produced the most talented players, Xavi did not enter as a phenomenon. He entered as a question mark. While other kids impressed with speed, strength, or flashy technique, Xavi was quieter, slower, almost unnoticeable to the naked eye. Coaches looked at him and saw a player lacking physicality. Scouts looked at him and wondered if this boy could survive in a world that increasingly demanded power and speed. And in a place where only the best were kept, doubt was not just a feeling, it was a sentence hanging over every child's head. There were training sessions where Xavi was easily beaten in challenges. There were matches where he was pushed over, overpowered, left behind. Not because he didn't try, but because his body seemed not built for the kind of soccer the world believed was right. And in an environment as harsh as La Masia, where talent alone wasn't enough and every mistake could be a reason to be cut. Xavi soon understood that he had no right to be like the others. If he tried to become them, he would fail. If he played the way they played, he would disappear. It was in those moments that a quiet change began. When he couldn't win with strength, Xavi started finding ways to win with something else. He observed more, thought more, moved earlier. He learned to pass the ball before the opponent could close in, learned to position himself correctly before danger arrived. While others reacted to the game, Xavi began to anticipate it, but that difference didn't make things easier. It only made him more alone. Because not everyone understood what he was doing. Not everyone could see the value in simple passes, in unglamorous movements. There were times when the doubt no longer came from the outside, but began to sink deep inside. Was he really good enough? Did everything he did even matter when no one really paid attention to it? At an age when many kids were still carefree, Xavi had to face a pressure not everyone recognized, the pressure to prove his own existence, not to become a star, just to not be eliminated, and that was perhaps the most painful thing in his early years. Not obvious failures, not the falls or the losses, but the feeling of having to constantly fight to stay, to continue, to be trusted just a little more. A battle without applause, without spotlights, only silence and lingering anxiety stretching through every training session, every match. But it was precisely in that silence that Xavi's will was formed. He had no other choice but to keep going. He couldn't be faster, so he would be smarter. He couldn't be stronger, so he would be more precise. He couldn't stand out in the way the world expected, so he would become irreplaceable in the way the world had never understood. And little by little, very slowly, very quietly, the small boy that soccer once didn't want to accept began to change the game itself, from the inside, in a way that no one had yet realized. The days at La Masia didn't teach Xavi Hernández how to become a stronger player. They forced him to become an entirely different player. When his body wouldn't allow him to run faster or challenge harder, Xavi gradually understood that if he kept trying to win with what he didn't have, he would always be the loser. And that was when another path opened up, a path no one guided him on, no coaching manual taught, and no one he could imitate. He began to learn how to think. Not think like a player, but think like the game itself. While the other kids chased the ball, Xavi began chasing space. He observed how the ball moved, how opponents moved, how teammates created openings, and most importantly, how everything would unfold next. For him, the match was no longer a series of disconnected moments, but a continuous chain of logic. If the ball is here, where will it be in a few seconds? If the opponent moves like that, what space will appear? And if he stands in this position, what will happen next? He didn't react to the game. He anticipated it. Gradually, Xavi began playing in a way that those around him couldn't understand. His passes weren't to solve the current situation, but to create a situation in the future. He passed the ball not because it was the safest option, but because it was the necessary step for 2, even 3 plays later. While other players sought explosive moments, Xavi quietly built them, one pass at a time, one small movement at a time that no one noticed. But that very difference became a form of isolation. On the field, he often found himself in positions his teammates couldn't comprehend in time. There were plays where he had already seen the space ahead, had moved into it, was ready to receive the ball. But the pass never came, not because his teammates didn't want to pass, but because they didn't see what he saw. And in those moments, Xavi stood alone, not because there was no one around, but because no one was truly playing the same game as him. There were times when the silence felt heavier than any criticism. No one said he was wrong, but no one said he was right either. He wasn't an obvious disappointment, but he also wasn't someone who made a strong impression. A kind of suspended existence, where you're not bad enough to be cut, but not stand out enough to be fully trusted. And that is one of the most uncomfortable forms of pressure, when you have to keep proving your worth without ever really knowing if it will be recognized. Yet, instead of changing to fit in, Xavi went even deeper into his own path. He accepted not being understood right away. He accepted having to play in a way that might take years for others to recognize its value. Because deep down, he knew what he was doing wasn't wrong. It was simply ahead of its time, and the price of being ahead of your time is always loneliness. As time went on, Xavi became more precise, quicker in thought, more refined in controlling the game. But alongside that, the gap between him and everyone else grew wider, not because he tried to separate himself, but because he no longer belonged to the same way of playing anymore. What was obvious to him was too complicated for others. What was simple to him was unnecessary to others. It was a very peculiar tragedy when your talent doesn't bring you closer to the world, but pushes you further away from it. When the better you get, the more different you become, and when you're more different, you're more alone. But Xavi never stopped. He didn't need the crowd to understand him right away. He didn't need the spotlight to validate his worth. All he needed was for the game to happen the right way. And if to make that happen he had to keep thinking more, seeing further, and playing in a way no one else could, then he was willing to pay that price, even if that price was years of prolonged silence, where a genius was slowly taking shape. But almost no one noticed. But soccer doesn't wait for anyone to understand you. It keeps moving forward, loud, dazzling, and full of spotlights shining only on a few chosen names. When Xavi Hernández stepped up to Barcelona's first team in the late 1990s, he didn't step into a world that was waiting for him. He stepped onto a stage already filled with big stars, strong personalities, and not long after, a name that would completely change everything. Ronaldinho. That was an era when soccer wasn't just tactics, but emotion, art, moments that made millions leap to their feet. Ronaldinho was the light, the smile, the magic, and in that world, Xavi was something completely different. He didn't dribble past three players. He didn't pull off moves that left fans gasping. He didn't create moments that television had to replay over and over. He passed the ball. He moved. He kept the rhythm. Necessary things, but not enough to make headlines. And gradually, a role took shape, not because he chose it, but because it was the only place he was allowed to exist. Xavi became the supporter, the one standing behind, the connector of the pieces so the stars up front could shine. In the big matches, people talked about Ronaldinho, about the goals, the solo runs, the smiles that made entire stadiums explode. And somewhere in the background, Xavi was still there, touching the ball dozens, hundreds of times, adjusting the tempo little by little, like a silent heartbeat that if it disappeared, the body would stop functioning. But no one calls out the heartbeat. People only remember the explosions. There were nights at Camp Nou, when the floodlights shone down on the grass and tens of thousands of people sang loudly. Xavi stood in the middle of it all but felt like part of the backdrop, not because he wasn't playing well, but because the way he played wasn't designed to be seen. He didn't create moments. He created the conditions for moments to exist, and that is a difference that most of the world never had the patience to recognize. The media, by instinct, looks for easy stories to tell. A dribbling genius, a goal-scoring striker, a hero with a decisive moment. But Xavi didn't fit any of those molds. How do you tell the story of someone whose value lies in things that can't be summed up in a highlight clip? How do you turn a simple pass into a headline when no one sees what happened before and after it? And so, he gradually became a familiar name, but not a name that was truly understood. People knew Xavi, but they didn't really see him. There were matches where he touched the ball more than anyone on the field. There were matches where he completely controlled the tempo, making opponents chase in vain, keeping the ball at his teammates' feet. But when the match ended, the stats didn't convey it in a way the crowd could feel. No goals, no clear assists, just a constant presence, an invisible form of control without which everything would collapse. And in that invisibility, a feeling began to grow. Not anger, not jealousy, but a very particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of existing without being seen. When you know you're doing the right thing, but no one really notices. When you understand your own value, but the world has no language to express it. Perhaps, in those rare moments after the match, when the stadium had emptied, when the noise had died down, Xavi wondered if there was another way for him to exist in this game. Should he change? Should he become more direct, more daring, more impressive? But every time, the answer came back to the same point. If he changed, he would no longer be himself, and if he was no longer himself, everything he had built would disappear. So he kept going, kept playing in his own way, kept accepting not being the center of the story, kept doing the work no one saw, but everything depended on it. And over time, a paradox became clearer. The more important Xavi became, the less attention he received. The better he controlled the game, the more normal his role seemed in others' eyes. It was a world where the most essential things were the least appreciated, and Xavi somehow became the perfect embodiment of that paradox. A player always present in every important moment, but rarely remembered as part of them, and perhaps that was when his second life truly began to take shape. Not when he was cut, but when he was kept, but never truly seen. And it was in that prolonged silence, when his presence became so obvious that no one even questioned it anymore, that a pain began to form. Not loud, not intense, but persistent and deep enough to be hard to name. Xavi Hernández didn't score the goals that made entire stadiums erupt. He didn't create the moments millions would rewind over and over on television. He wasn't the one ending the story. He was the one writing it line by line that no one read. And in a world where value is often measured by final moments, where the spotlight only shines on the goal scorer, Xavi's role was gradually pushed out of the frame. There were matches where he touched the ball more than 100 times, controlled the entire tempo, made opponents chase in vain. But when the match ended, people only remembered the goal. They remembered the shot. They remembered the player raising their arms in celebration. No one remembered the passes before that, the quiet movements that opened up space, the split-second decisions that kept the system from collapsing. And Xavi, who had done all of that, walked off the field in silence. The media had no place for stories like that. They needed heroes. They needed names that could make headlines, faces that could sell the story. And Xavi, with his calmness, with his unflashy style, with contributions that couldn't be summed up in a single moment, didn't fit what they were looking for. He appeared in articles, but usually in the background. He was mentioned, but not as the center. Even in the biggest victories, he was still just part of the collective, an important part, but not the one being retold. And gradually, a question began to echo inside him. Not once, but many times, repeating in quiet moments, when the noise of the stadium had faded, when the lights had gone out, when it was just him with himself. Am I really important? It wasn't doubt about his ability. He knew what he could do. He knew how he controlled the game. But value doesn't only come from what you do, it also comes from how the world perceives it. And when the world keeps overlooking you, when your name isn't called in the big moments, when your contributions aren't retold, that question grew heavier and heavier. There were moments when Xavi might have wondered if there was another path. Could he play more directly, take more risks, seek out moments to be seen? Could he become the hero in the way the world expected? But every time he returned to the simplest truth. If he changed to become someone else, the system he had spent his entire life building would no longer function the same way. And if the system collapsed, then everything he believed in would collapse with it. That was a choice few people ever have to face between being seen and doing what is right. And Xavi, time and time again, chose the second one. He accepted not being called out as long as the team ran smoothly. He accepted not becoming the hero as long as the story had a happy ending. But that sacrifice, no matter how noble, still left a void. Because deep down, any human being wants to be recognized. Not out of ego, but because that's how the world tells you that what you do matters. And when that recognition doesn't come, or comes too little, too late, it doesn't disappear. It settles. It accumulates. It becomes a kind of sadness that's very hard to explain. A sadness of having given so much, but never really receiving anything equivalent in return. And perhaps the most painful thing wasn't that Xavi wasn't praised. It was that most of the world didn't even realize what they had missed. They had watched the game. They had cheered. They had celebrated. But they hadn't seen the person who made all of it possible. In a world that celebrates finishers, Xavi existed as the starter. In a world that loves moments, he built processes. And in a world always searching for heroes, he chose to become something even more important, a foundation no one notices, but without which nothing can stand. And that very choice, however noble, however right, became a form of tragedy. A tragedy without tears, without collapse, but stretching through every match, every season, every year, where one person kept giving, kept perfecting, kept keeping everything running, but still had to live with a question no one else could answer for him. Am I really important? That question didn't disappear. It only stepped back, quietly, waiting for a big enough moment to be replaced by something stronger, recognition. And then, that moment came, in the summer of 2008, when Xavi Hernández stepped into a tournament that would later be seen as the beginning of one of the greatest eras in European soccer history. Euro 2008 wasn't just a tournament. It was the answer to a question Spanish soccer had carried for many years. Could they win in their own way, or would they keep falling under the pressure of decisive moments? And in the journey to find that answer, Xavi was no longer on the edge of the story. For the first time, he was right in the center of it. Spain played a style of soccer the world hadn't fully understood, yet ball possession, short passes, constant movement, patience to the point of almost challenging the viewer's attention. And at the center of it all was Xavi. He didn't need to score to define the game. He defined it by how it unfolded. Every touch of his was like a decision, every pass a directive, every movement a reminder of where the game was heading. When Spain kept the ball, they weren't just keeping the ball, they were keeping control. And when they controlled, that's when Xavi controlled. In the final, the key plays, the moments when everything could have fallen apart, he was still there, calm as if nothing could shake him. And when the tournament ended, when Spain finally touched the major title they had waited so long for, something rare happened. The world looked toward Xavi, not as a supporting name, not as part of the system, but as an individual. He was awarded the title of Player of the Tournament, MVP of Euro 2008. For the first time in his career, it wasn't someone else. It was him who was called the most important. That should have been a liberating moment. An answer to all those years of silence, a confirmation that what he had done, what he had sacrificed, what he had persistently pursued, had finally been seen. But the feeling Xavi carried wasn't entirely like that, because recognition that comes late always carries something incomplete. When the spotlight shone on him, when the award was handed over, when his name was mentioned across every media outlet, Xavi wasn't a completely new person. He was still the one who had lived in invisibility for so many years. He was still the one who had learned to exist without needing attention. And so, when the spotlight finally found him, it didn't bring a sense of belonging. It brought a sense of strangeness. There is a gap between being recognized and feeling truly understood, and Xavi stood right in the middle of that gap. The press began writing about him. Experts began analyzing his role. People talked about the brain, the heartbeat, the game conductor. Phrases that had rarely appeared before. But even in that praise there was still a limit, because to truly understand Xavi, people had to change the way they looked at soccer. And that wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. It wasn't common. In the same tournament, there were clearer moments. Goals, finishes, images anyone could recall after just one viewing. And though Xavi was the one who laid the foundation for all of it, the spotlight still tended to slide toward the more understandable moments. He was recognized, but not fully as the center of collective memory. And it was there that a new feeling formed. No longer the pain of being completely overlooked, but a kind of displacement within his own success. He had achieved what he once doubted he could achieve. He had stood at the peak of European soccer. He had been named, but when it all settled, when the articles stopped appearing, when the tournament became the past, a familiar question returned this time. Not from the darkness, but from the light itself. Did they really understand him? Because recognition doesn't always mean understanding. And for a player like Xavi, whose value lies in things that aren't easily visible, that difference is enormous. He could be awarded titles, but that didn't mean the way he played soccer had been fully felt. He could be praised, but that didn't guarantee his actions would be remembered in the right way. And perhaps what made that moment heavier was the realization that this might be the only peak where he was seen so clearly. Not because he wouldn't keep playing well, not because he wouldn't remain important, but because the nature of the role he took on wasn't designed to always be at the center of the story. Euro 2008 didn't change Xavi. It only changed how the world looked at him for a short period of time. And after that, everything began slipping back to the familiar state. He kept passing the ball, kept controlling the tempo, kept doing the things no one else could do. But this time, he carried a clearer awareness that even when recognized, he might still not be understood. Even when standing at the peak, he could still feel out of place. And that is a more subtle form of tragedy. Not never being seen, but being seen yet never fully understood. That sense of displacement didn't disappear when Xavi Hernández returned to Barcelona. On the contrary, it entered a new phase, where everything around him became more perfect than ever. But the feeling inside became more complex than ever. When Pep Guardiola took over the team, he didn't just bring a new tactic. He brought a philosophy, a completely different understanding of soccer, a system where the ball had to move faster than the players, space had to be controlled before it even appeared, and the game had to be shaped from the smallest details. And at the center of it all was Xavi. For the first time in his career, he was no longer a supporting piece. He was the fulcrum, the pivot, the point every ball passed through, the one deciding the rhythm of every attack, every defensive moment. If the system was a body, then Xavi was the brain. Everything started from him, went through him, and came back to him. Every short pass, every off-ball movement, every decision to hold or accelerate, all under his control. Barcelona began playing soccer that made the whole world stop and watch. They didn't just win, they dominated. They kept opponents from touching the ball, made the strongest teams helpless, turned matches into lessons in absolute control. And at the center of all those victories, Xavi operated like a heartbeat that never stopped beating, steady, precise, and almost invisible. But it was precisely in that perfection that a paradox began to form. The more the system shone, the more Barcelona became an icon. Tiki-taka became a philosophy mentioned around the world. People talked about the team, about how they played, about their dominance. And in those stories, Xavi was still there, but not the center of attention, because when a system becomes perfect, it starts to overshadow the individuals who created it. The 5-0 wins, 6-1 thrashings, performances that stunned the world. They were remembered as collective triumphs. People praised the philosophy, praised the style, praised the cohesion, but very few stopped to ask, who was the one making all of it run so smoothly? Who kept the system from collapsing even for a single moment? And the answer, as always, wasn't something easy to see. There were matches where Xavi touched the ball more than 150 times. He controlled the tempo from start to finish, leaving opponents with no chance to fight back. But when the match ended, the highlights only captured the goals, the finishes, the final moments. No one rewound to the 37th pass, the 82nd, or the 119th, those passes that kept everything from falling apart. And gradually, a truth became clearer than ever. Xavi had created a system that made him invisible in the process. He had spent his entire career building a way of playing where the individual was no longer the center. He believed in the collective, believed in structure, believed that everyone had to move as one unified block. But that very belief, when it reached its peak, erased his role as an individual. That was a very special kind of tragedy, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too perfectly. There were nights at Camp Nou when Barcelona played soccer that was nearly flawless, when the whole world stood up to applaud, when experts called it the greatest team in history. Xavi was still there at the center of everything, but not the face people remembered first. He was the one who made everything look easy, to the point that people forgot just how difficult it really was. And perhaps deep down he understood that better than anyone. He knew that if he stopped, the system would slow down. If he missed a beat, the whole team would lose balance. If he wasn't there, things wouldn't run as smoothly anymore. But he also knew that most of the world wouldn't notice unless he disappeared. And that was the biggest paradox of his career. His value only became truly clear when he was no longer there. But Xavi never played football to be seen in that way. He didn't need to disappear to prove his worth. He just kept doing his job, kept the system running, kept believing in the philosophy that he and Guardiola had built, one that put the collective above everything else. Yet with every win, every trophy, every praise given to Barcelona or tiki-taka, there was always something hard to name. Not jealousy, not regret, but a vague feeling that he had created something so big it no longer needed his name to exist. He had become the foundation, and like every foundation, he was buried deep beneath what was built on top. But what makes this story even more painful is not that he was overshadowed, it's that he willingly accepted it. He understood that if the system was to work at its absolute best, he had to sacrifice being seen. He had to play in a way that made him look ordinary to others, even though the reality was the complete opposite. And so he carried on, kept passing, kept controlling, kept holding everything together so it wouldn't collapse. Not because he didn't want recognition, but because he believed there were things more important than recognition. But that belief, no matter how strong, could never completely erase one truth, that sometimes, to create something truly great, you have to accept disappearing inside it. And Xavi, with all his consistency and sacrifice, did exactly that for many years without anyone truly realizing the price he was paying. And when a person accepts disappearing for too long inside what they've created, that disappearance doesn't just stay on the pitch. It starts creeping into life. It becomes part of who they are. For Xavi Hernández, the peak years under Pep Guardiola weren't just the most successful period of his career. They were also the time he lived most vividly in two parallel lives. The first life was the one the world saw. A tactical genius, a brain running matches with near-perfect precision, a player who could control the tempo of an entire game as if he were controlling time itself. In that life, Xavi made no mistakes, no panic, No getting swept up in emotion. Every touch had purpose. Every pass had meaning. He didn't just play football. He defined how football should be played. But the second life, no one really saw it. In that life, he wasn't a genius. He wasn't the brain. He wasn't the heartbeat of a perfect system. He was a human being who had to live with pressures that had no way to be released. Because when you are the center of a perfect system, you are not allowed to be wrong. Not because others won't forgive, but because even one small mistake could bring the whole system down, and that pressure didn't come match by match. It existed in every single moment. Every time he received the ball, he had to know what would happen next. Every time he passed, he had to be certain it was the right choice. There was no room for hesitation. No room for hesitation. No room for uncontrolled improvisation. No room for moments of just trying to see what happens. Because when you are the one keeping the rhythm, everything depends on you. And the cruelest part was, no one really noticed. They saw the ease. They saw the short passes. They saw the control. But they didn't see the constant decisions happening inside his head. They didn't see the pressure of having to be perfect every single second. They didn't see the exhaustion building up when you're never allowed to let go. That's how burnout begins. Not with one big collapse, but with tiny cracks repeating day after day after day. There were matches where Xavi left the field with a win, with praise for the team, with the feeling that everything had gone according to plan. But deep inside, he felt empty. Not because he didn't love football, but because he had controlled it for so long that he could no longer feel it naturally anymore. Joy was gradually replaced by responsibility. Creativity was gradually replaced by duty. And every time he stepped onto the pitch, he wasn't just playing football anymore. He was carrying the entire system on his shoulders, but he never talked about it. There were no interviews about the fatigue, no complaints about the pressure, no moments where he stood in front of the media and explained what he was going through. Xavi chose silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't believe those things needed to be said. There was a very deep discipline in him, a belief that his job was to make everything run, not to explain why it was so hard. And so he carried on, kept playing, kept controlling, kept playing, bust being perfect, even when inside everything was starting to get tired. There were moments, very rare ones, when the tempo of the game slowed down, when he had a second to look around the crowd, his teammates, the opponents, and realize that no one really knew what he was going through. They saw a player who was always calm, always precise, always in control, but they didn't see the price of that control. And perhaps what made it all heavier was that he couldn't stop, because when you are the center of the system, you don't have the right to be tired. When you are the one keeping the rhythm, you don't have the right to lose the rhythm. When you are the one making everything run, you don't have the right to stop and ask whether you're still okay. That is the second life of Xavier, life without spotlights, without applause, without recognition. A life where he had to face himself, face the exhaustion, face the questions that had no clear answers. And gradually, those two lives began to collide. On the pitch, he remained perfect, but off the pitch, he increasingly felt detached from himself. He was no longer the boy from Terrassa playing football for joy. He had become part of a machine. He had helped create a machine that never stopped demanding, never stopped running, never stopped requiring absolute precision. And the most painful thing was, that machine had no room for emotion, no room for weakness, no room for saying I'm tired. So he kept silent, kept playing the role the world needed him to play, kept living two lives, one that everyone praised, and one that no one knew about. And perhaps it was that silence, stretching on through the years, that truly wore him down. Not the matches, not the pressure to win, but having to carry all of it alone, with no way to share it, no place to let it out. A genius on the field. A human being trapped inside his own perfection off the field. And between those two worlds, Xavi continued to exist, quietly, precisely, and increasingly exhausted in a way no one could see. And then there was one night that should have belonged to him, but in the end became the clearest proof of the tragedy of his entire life. That was the night when Xavi Hernández controlled the whole world, but ended up owning almost no memory of it. The 2010 World Cup in South Africa was not just the peak of a tournament, it was the peak of an entire generation, of a philosophy, of a way of playing football that Xavi had devoted his whole life to pursuing. Spain entered the final not just hoping to win, but with a belief that they could redefine the way a world champion team should play. And at the center of that belief, as always, was Xavi. The final was not a festival of goals. It was a tense, tight battle where the smallest mistake could decide everything. The Netherlands played rough, physical football, trying to break the rhythm, break the control, break the very essence of Spain. And in a match like that, where everything could slip away in a single moment, Xavi's role became more important than ever. He didn't score. He didn't create a moment the crowd would remember forever. But he kept everything from falling apart. Every time Spain had the ball, he was the anchor. Every time the pressure mounted, he slowed the game down. Every time the opponents tried to drag them into chaos, he pulled them back to order. He didn't win the match with one moment. He kept the match alive long enough for that moment to happen. 120 minutes of tension passed like a test of will. And then, in the 116th minute, the moment the whole world would remember forever arrived. Andrés Iniesta received the ball inside the box. A shot. The ball went in, and history was rewritten. Spain won the World Cup for the first time in their history. The whole world erupted. The images that followed became iconic. Iniesta ripping off his shirt in celebration, players piling on each other, fans crying, commentators screaming. It was the moment millions would remember, would retell, would watch over and over for years to come. But in all those memories, Xavi was almost nowhere to be found. Not because he wasn't there, but because his role couldn't be captured in a single moment. He had orchestrated the entire match. He had kept Spain from being sucked into chaos. He had ensured they still played their way, still controlled, still stayed patient, so that finally, Iniesta's moment could happen. But when history was told, it wasn't told that way. People remembered the goal. People remembered the scorer. People remembered the moment. And Xavi became part of the background again. That was the peak of his career. A World Cup, a title any player dreams of. A night when he did everything right. A night when he controlled the match at the highest level. A night when, by every tactical standard, he was one of the most important players on the field. But when the memory was formed, he didn't own it. And that was the greatest tragedy, because the memory of football doesn't belong to what actually happened. It belongs to what was seen, what was felt in a fleeting moment, and in the system Xavi had spent his whole life building, where everything was created. From process, from control, from tiny details, he had unintentionally placed himself in a position where memory couldn't reach. Perhaps in that celebration moment, when he hugged his teammates, when he lifted the golden trophy, when he stood among the people who had traveled the long journey with him, some part of him felt complete, but another part quietly recognized the truth, that even when he reached the peak of the world, he still might not be the one remembered. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because the way he existed in this game didn't align with the way the world remembers it. He wasn't a moment. He was the process leading up to that moment. And in a world that loves moments, people like Xavi always stand at the edge of memory. That night, He controlled the whole world. But when the world looked back, they remembered a different name, and perhaps that was the clearest time his two lives collided. One life where he was the center of everything, and one life where he almost disappeared from what mattered most. A world champion, an architect of history, but not the owner of its memory. And when everything settled down, when the cheers faded, when the trophy became a memory, Xavi returned to his familiar position at the center of the game. But on the edge of the story the world would tell forever. And after the night the whole world called glory, when the cheers had died down and the trophy became a memento placed on a shelf, Xavi Hernández didn't step out from under the pressure. He stepped back into it, deeper, heavier, and more refined, because the 2010 World Cup didn't free him. It locked him into a standard from which there was no going back. He was no longer a great player. He became the measure of perfection. And once you become the measure, you are no longer allowed to fall below yourself, not even a little. Every match after that was no longer an opportunity to prove. It was a test where the default result had to be perfect. Every pass of his didn't just need to be accurate, it had to be at the right time, the right rhythm, the right purpose. A wrong pass wasn't just a personal mistake, it was a crack in the system. And Xavi knew that better than anyone. Because he didn't just play in the system, he was the one keeping the system alive. There were players who could make mistakes and be forgiven. A striker could miss a chance, then score the next minute and become the hero. A defender could commit a foul, then make up for it with a block. But for Xavi, mistakes didn't have the chance to be fixed so easily. Because his mistakes weren't always obvious. They didn't lie in one specific action. They lay in a shifted tempo, in a broken structure, in a moment when everything no longer flowed as smoothly as before. And once that happened, the whole team could lose the control they had built over 90 minutes. That was the pressure no one saw. They saw a player passing accurately. They saw a team controlling the match. They saw the ease. But they didn't see the constant thoughts in his head. Hundreds of small decisions in every match, every decision having to be right. No room for randomness. No room for let's see what happens. Everything had to be calculated, controlled, kept within the boundaries he had set. And gradually, football stopped being a game. It became a responsibility, a duty, a system he couldn't escape. There were matches where Xavi played near perfectly passing accuracy, close to 100%, complete control of the midfield, no chances for the opponents. But even in those matches, he still didn't feel relief. Because perfection didn't bring freedom. It brought repetition. A reminder that you had to do it again, and again, and again. And each time, the pressure didn't decrease. It increased. Because once you've proven you can be perfect, the world won't accept you becoming ordinary. Perhaps, in those rare moments when he sat alone, when there was no more noise, when there was no more match, a strange feeling appeared, one he didn't easily admit. It wasn't the fear of failure. He had overcome that long ago. It was the fear of no longer being allowed to be wrong. A more subtle, deeper, harder to escape form of pressure, because mistakes to some degree are part of being human. They allow you to experiment, create, change. But when you no longer have the right to make mistakes, you also lose part of that freedom. You no longer play football, you operate it. And Xavi, gradually, became a perfect operator of a machine he couldn't turn off. There were moments when he received the ball, looked up, and in a very brief instant, he knew he could do something different. A riskier pass, a less safe decision, a more personal moment. But then, almost instinctively, he returned to the safest choice, the most accurate, the most precise. Not because he didn't dare, but because he wasn't allowed. And it was in those moments that a truth slowly became clear. He wasn't just controlling the match. He was bound by the very way he controlled it. That was the prison of perfection. No walls, no locks, no guards. But you still couldn't leave, because you were the one who built it. And every time you played right, every time you controlled well, every time you were perfect, you laid another brick, making that prison stronger. Xavi never complained about it. He didn't stand in front of the media and talk about the pressure. He didn't seek sympathy, because, in a way, he accepted it as part of who he was. He believed that if he wanted to reach that level of control, if he wanted to play football the way he believed was right, then this was the price he had to pay. But accepting something doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean it doesn't wear you down. It doesn't mean it doesn't leave tiny cracks that gradually build up over time. And perhaps what made everything heavier was that no one really realized he was trapped. They looked at him and saw stability. They looked at him and saw control. They looked at him and saw a player who was almost perfect. But they didn't see the price of that perfection. They didn't see that behind every accurate pass was a decision that wasn't allowed to be wrong. They didn't see that behind every controlled match was a pressure that wasn't allowed to let up. They didn't see that behind that calmness was a human being who had learned to lock his emotions away, so as not to disrupt the system. And so he carried on. Kept playing. Kept being perfect. Kept living in a prison that no one else could see. A world champion. The brain of the greatest system in history. A human being imprisoned by his own excellence. And the scariest thing wasn't that he couldn't escape. It was that he wasn't sure anymore if he even wanted to escape. And then, when a person has grown used to living in absolute control, in a system where every heartbeat is shaped by himself, the scariest thing isn't making a mistake. It's when the world around you starts changing in ways you can no longer control. For Xavi Hernández, that change didn't come in one clear moment. It came slowly, almost imperceptibly, until everything had completely shifted. Football started getting faster. Not just faster in bursts of speed, but faster in the way matches were decided. Teams were no longer patient, waiting. They pressed higher, ran more, collided harder, and most importantly, they were no longer afraid of not having the ball. Instead of keeping the ball to control the game, they accepted losing it to create chances in transition moments. A completely different philosophy, almost the opposite of everything Xavi had spent his life building. And along with that change, the way the world viewed football changed too. What was once seen as the pinnacle ball control, short passing, patience, started being questioned. People called tiki-taka slow, boring, lacking directness. Matches with hundreds of passes were no longer praised the way they used to be. Instead, they sought speed, power, quick transitions, moments that could decide a game in seconds. And in that flow, Xavi wasn't just a player. He became a symbol of a kind of football the world was gradually leaving behind. No longer the brain of an era, but a remnant of a bygone time. That was the change he couldn't control, couldn't adjust with just one pass, couldn't keep in rhythm the way he did on the pitch. It happened outside of him, but it directly affected everything he represented. There were matches where Barcelona still controlled possession, still passed hundreds of times, still played the old philosophy. But this time, the fans didn't applaud the way they used to. There were whistles. There was criticism. There were questions. Whether this kind of football was still relevant. And in those questions, Xavi wasn't just placed at the center. He became the answer many people wanted to deny. Not because he was playing worse, but because the world no longer wanted what he represented. That was another kind of tragedy. When you don't change, but everything around you changes so much that you become out of place in the very thing you once defined. There were moments when Xavi received the ball in midfield, when he slowed the game down, when he looked for space the way he always did. But instead of patience, he felt impatience. Not from his teammates, but from the fans. from the media, from the very atmosphere around him, an invisible pressure that the game needed to be faster, more direct, more modern. And in those moments, a new question began to emerge. Not am I still important, but is what I believe in still right? That was the question anyone deeply attached to a philosophy fears facing, because it doesn't just concern how you play. It concerns how you see the world. If the world changes and you don't change with it, you'll be left behind. But if you change, are you still yourself? Xavi stood between those two choices, and just like every time before, he chose to stay with what he believed was right. He didn't turn into a different player. He didn't abandon his philosophy to chase trends. He kept playing the way he believed was best for the team, for the match, for the very essence of football. But this time, that consistency didn't bring recognition. It brought doubt. And perhaps the most painful thing wasn't the criticism. It was watching what he had spent his entire life building: a system, a philosophy, a way of understanding football being reframed as a question. Not, how good is it? But, is it still relevant? There were still fans who believed in him. There were still teammates who understood his value. But the wider world, louder and faster, began moving in a different direction. And in that flow, Xavi was no longer the center. He became a memory, gradually being replaced, a symbol of the past. And it was in that very moment that his two lives collided once again. The life of a tactical genius who still saw the game in ways few others could, and the life of a human being forced to face the truth that sometimes it's not that you're wrong, it's that the world no longer wants the right thing you represent. A very hard-to-name feeling emerged. Not anger, not disappointment, but a kind of loss, as if you were standing on a road you had built, looking ahead, and realizing that no one was walking with you anymore. And you weren't sure whether you should keep going or turn back. But for Xavi, turning back had never been an option. He could only keep going. Even as the world began to leave him behind, and as the world gradually turned its back on the kind of football he represented, the end didn't come with a big bang. It came quietly, almost invisibly, just like the way Xavi Hernández had existed throughout his entire career. No clear tragic moment, no final match written like an epic chapter, just a slow withdrawal, where a legend stepped off the stage, and almost no one noticed right away. In his final years at Barcelona, Xavi was no longer the center of the system like before, not because he lost his ability, but because the system had changed, the tempo was different, and the world around him no longer operated the way he once controlled. He still passed accurately, he still read the game better than most, but this time, those qualities were no longer enough to keep him in the position he once held. And then, the decision to leave came. Not loud, not controversial, not a dramatic farewell, just an announcement, a choice, a step that seemed to have been accepted long before it actually happened. Xavi left Barcelona, the club he had spent nearly his entire life building, shaping, and dedicating himself to without an ending that matched his stature. Not because the club didn't respect him, but because his nature had never fit grand farewells. There are legends who leave with tribute matches, tears, speeches, images preserved forever. But Xavi wasn't that kind of person. He didn't belong to big moments. He belonged to long processes, small details, things whose value people only realize once they're gone. And so he left, just as he had always existed. Quietly. Then came Qatar, a destination many looked at and saw as a step back, a place for players past their prime, a final chapter with little meaning and a great career. To the world, it was a gentle, even slightly disappointing ending. But for Xavi, it was a continuation not of the spotlight, but of who he was. There was no longer the pressure of Camp Nou, no longer the expectation to be perfect with every pass. no longer a system that depended entirely on him. But there was also no longer the attention, no more lights, no more discussions about his role in modern football. And it was in that quietness that a feeling began to emerge. Not complete relief, but an emptiness, because when you've lived too long at the center of something, even if you felt trapped in it, leaving it doesn't bring instant freedom. It brings emptiness, a feeling as if a part of you had been left behind. Xavi no longer had to control the match, but he was also no longer the one the match revolved around. And in that silence, a truth slowly became clear: the world of football kept moving forward. It didn't stop. It didn't look back. New players emerged. New systems were built. New stories were told. And in those stories, his name no longer appeared as often as before. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because the memory of football always moves on, and people like Xavi, the ones not tied to easily remembered moments, are often the ones who fade away the fastest. That's a very subtle form of being forgotten, not completely erased, but gradually no longer at the center of attention, no longer mentioned every day, no longer the standard people compare against. And perhaps in those rare moments when he looked back the years at Barcelona, the titles, the matches he controlled, an old question returned. This time with a different shade. All of that, was it really remembered the right way? Because if memory doesn't reflect the true value, then where does that value exist? In the numbers? In the trophies? Or only within him, a human being who lived and understood it in a way most of the world never quite managed to notice? Xavi didn't try to answer that question. He didn't try to pull himself back into the spotlight. He didn't create a big story to keep his name in everyone's memory. He continued living the way he always had, quietly, disciplined, and loyal to what he believed was right. But that didn't make the ending any lighter, because sometimes the most painful thing isn't failure. It's ending a great journey without a single moment that truly belonged to you. A legend leaves, not loudly, not dramatically, no exclamation point, just a quiet period, as if he had never really existed in the story the whole world had witnessed. But there are people who cannot abandon what defined them. And for Xavi Hernández, Barcelona wasn't just a club. It was identity. It was memory. It was the place where he became himself, and also the place where he gradually disappeared into the perfection he created. So when that club fell into crisis, when everything that was once pride began to collapse, his return wasn't a choice. It was almost inevitable. The Barcelona of that time was no longer the team he once knew. No more control, no more confidence, no more clear identity. They weren't just losing matches, they were losing the very way they understood football. What had once been the foundation, tiki-taka, control, patience, had now become vague concepts, replaced by chaos, lack of direction, and patchwork efforts that weren't enough to keep the system standing. And in that context, Xavi returned not as a celebrated legend, but as someone expected to fix it all. Not just the results, not just the form, but an entire system that had lost itself. The pressure this time wasn't like when he was a player. Back then, he had to control the match, but now he had to control a club, a collective with too many problems: financial, personnel, psychological, and even faith that had been eroded over time. And worse still, he could no longer fix everything with one pass. On the sidelines, he was no longer the one touching the ball directly. He couldn't adjust the tempo of the match himself. He couldn't correct mistakes in the moment. He could only observe, direct, and hope that what he conveyed would be carried out correctly. But football, as he knew all too well, was never that simple. The first few matches carried hope, a little change, a little sign of the old football. But then reality quickly returned. The defeats, the inconsistent performances, the moments when the team no longer reflected the philosophy he was trying to rebuild. And along with that, the criticism began to appear. No longer the silence like when he was a player. This time the world spoke plainly. They questioned him, his coaching ability, whether his philosophy was still relevant, whether he was just a product of a bygone era, unable to recreate itself in the new context. That was a completely different kind of pressure. As a player, he was misunderstood, but he could still prove his value on the pitch. Now he no longer had that direct control. He had to trust others, had to accept that results didn't depend only on him, and when the results didn't come immediately, the world's patience didn't come either. There were nights when Barcelona lost, when mistakes repeated, when everything seemed to stall. Xavi stood on the touchline, no longer the one controlling the match, but the one watching it slip out of his grasp, a feeling he had never had to face as a player. And it was in those moments that a deeper tragedy slowly emerged. Not that he wasn't trying, but that what he was trying to save may have changed so much that it could no longer be saved the old way. The Barcelona he returned to was no longer the Barcelona he had left. The world of football he understood was no longer the world that existed, and the philosophy he believed in, though still true in essence, was no longer easy to apply in an environment that had transformed too much. That was a battle not just against opponents on the pitch, but against time, against change, against his own memory. Xavi wasn't just trying to build a team, he was trying to restore an identity. But identity isn't something that can be recreated through sheer will alone. It needs the right people. It needs the right circumstances. It needs a world willing to accept it. And when those things no longer exist, his efforts become solitary. There were moments when he looked at his team and saw incomplete pieces. Players who didn't grow up in that system, habits that couldn't be changed overnight. And he understood that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't turn back time. But he still continued, not because he believed everything would return to the way it was, but because he didn't know how to give up. That was his nature, resolute, loyal, and willing to endure. But that very nature, this time, made everything more painful. Because he was fighting for something that might no longer exist. An identity that had changed. A world that had moved on. And a man still trying to hold on to what once made everything. Not because he didn't see the truth, but because he couldn't accept letting it disappear. And in that battle, Xavi once again stood at the center, not of a perfect system, but of a question without a clear answer. Can you save something that no longer exists, or are you just trying to hold on to your own memory? And when a person spends their entire life building a world, the most painful thing isn't when that world disappears. It's when it still exists in memory, but no longer exists in reality. For Xavi Hernández, that wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It became a state of being, a prolonged, silent state where he stood between two worlds, a world that was once perfect and a world he no longer fully belonged to. He belonged to the golden era, an era when football was played in the way he understood most deeply: control, patience, precision, and elegance down to the smallest detail. An era when every pass of his wasn't just a technical action, but part of a larger structure where everything had meaning. There, he didn't just exist. He was the center, the shaper, the one who made everything run. But that era had passed, not completely vanished, but no longer the center of the football world. And in the new reality, where speed, athleticism, and directness dominated, the philosophy Xavi carried was no longer accepted the way it once was celebrated. It was still right, but no longer enough. It was still beautiful, but no longer what the world pursued. And so he stood in the middle, no longer fully belonging to the past, because the past couldn't come back, but also not fully belonging to the present, because the present wasn't built for him. That was a very particular kind of being stuck. Not outright rejection, but having nowhere that truly belonged to him. There were days when he looked back on the old years, the matches he controlled, the titles, the moments when the whole world stopped to watch Barcelona. A clear feeling emerged, not mere pride, but a certainty that he had once understood this game at a level few ever reached. But then, when he returned to reality, the difficult matches, the systems that didn't operate as he wanted, the players who didn't move the way he envisioned, that feeling no longer carried the same strength. It became a reminder that what was once right was no longer easy to apply. And right there, a collapse began. Not loud, not dramatic. There was no single specific moment when everything shattered. It was just a process, slow, deep, and silent. Xavi didn't lose faith in football. He didn't abandon his philosophy, but he began to realize that holding on to something too tightly for too long can make you no longer flexible enough to adapt to what's changing around you. And that created an inner conflict. One part of him wanted to keep everything as it was, wanted to keep believing that if done the right way, if persisted long enough, if built solidly enough, everything would come back as before. But another part began to understand that the world doesn't work that way. That football, like everything else, always moves forward, whether you're ready or not. And when those two parts exist at the same time, with neither truly winning and neither truly disappearing, you no longer feel stable. You no longer know which path is right. You no longer feel certain whether you should hold on or change. And for someone who once controlled everything like Xavi, that is a very hard-to-accept form of disorientation. There were moments, very brief, very rare, when he stood alone, not on the pitch, not in front of the media, but just with himself, and clearly felt that emptiness. Not because he no longer had value, but because he was no longer sure where that value should be placed in the current world. He was no longer the boy from Terrassa who had to prove he was worthy. He was no longer the misunderstood player. He was no longer the brain of a perfect system. He was a human being, trying to find his place in a world that had changed. And the hardest thing wasn't not finding the answer right away. It was having to live inside that question. Every day, every match, every decision. A prolonged state where you're not completely lost, but also not completely certain. And it's that very state, unclear, indecisive, without an end point, that wears you down the most. Not failure, not criticism, but the ambiguity, the not belonging, the existence between two worlds with no place that truly feels like home. Xavi didn't collapse in a way people could see. No tears, no statements, no surrender. Just a very small, very deep change in the way he looked at himself. A realization that sometimes being part of history doesn't guarantee you'll always have a clear place in the present. And in that silence, he continued. Not like before, no longer as certain as before, but still continued, because that was the only thing he knew how to do, even when he was no longer sure where he was going. And perhaps when all the questions still hang in the air, when the world keeps changing without waiting for anyone, the final answer about Xavi Hernández doesn't lie in whether he's still relevant or not. It lies in what he did with this game, and that will outlast any trend. Because if you look back at his entire journey, from the small boy in Terrassa to the man standing between memory and reality, there's one undeniable truth. Xavi was never the one the world easily saw, and perhaps the world never truly saw him completely. He wasn't the one scoring the decisive goals. He wasn't the one making the entire stadium erupt in a single moment. He wasn't the first face on the headlines after every victory. But he was the one who made all of that possible. He was the one standing behind the moments the world loved, the one creating the conditions for other stars to shine, the one keeping the system running when everything could collapse. A role without glamour, but irreplaceable. There are players remembered for what they did in 1 second. Xavi will be remembered for what he did throughout the entire match. There are those who become legends because of moments. Xavi became a legend because of processes. And that is exactly what makes his legacy different. Not because it's bigger, but because it's bigger. But because it's deeper. He didn't just win titles. He wasn't just part of a great team. He changed the way football was played. He changed the way people understood controlling a match. He changed the way people understood controlling a match. He changed the role of a central midfielder. Before Xavi, ball control might have been just a tactic. After Xavi, it became a philosophy. Before Xavi, passing might have been just a means. After Xavi, it became an art. And no matter how the world changes, no matter how football moves forward in other directions, what he left behind still exists, not on stat sheets, but in the way millions of young players learn to see the game. They may not mention his name every day, but they play football in the way he helped shape. That is a form of legacy that doesn't need to be mentioned to exist, doesn't need praise to have value, doesn't need to be seen to be recognized. And perhaps that is the perfect ending for a man who spent his entire life existing in the invisible. Xavi didn't need to be the hero in the world's memory. He didn't need to own the moments people retell forever. Because he didn't belong to moments. He belonged to the structure that created them. He didn't belong to the spotlight. He belonged to the system that gave the spotlight meaning. And when all of that is put together, when his journey is viewed not through what's easily seen, but through what truly matters, one truth becomes clearer than ever. Xavi wasn't the player the world never saw. He was the player the world never looked deep enough to understand. But that doesn't diminish his value. If anything, it only makes his legacy more special, because there are people who don't need to be clearly seen to exist, don't need to be retold correctly to have meaning. They exist in the very way the world operates after they're gone, and Xavi is one of them. A man who controlled matches as if he controlled time. A human being who lived two lives, one the world praised, and one the world never truly understood. But in the end, perhaps that no longer matters. Because whether the world saw him or not, he was still there. In every pass, in every rhythm, in the way football is played, not as a game of moments, but as a flow of meaning. And in that flow, Xavi didn't disappear. He became part of it, forever. The story of Xavi Hernández leaves behind a very particular kind of sadness, not the sadness of failure, but the sadness of a man who devoted his entire life to perfection yet was rarely seen completely. We see it clearly through the details running through the story. From the small boy at La Masia, always doubted because of his build, to the man controlling the entire 2010 World Cup final, yet having the memory belong to Andrés Iniesta. From the center of the tiki-taka system under Pep Guardiola but made invisible by that very system, to a coach returning to Barcelona, hoping to save its identity only to face a world that had changed. What makes it heartbreaking isn't that Xavi lacked talent or titles, but that he always lived in that second life, where the pressure of perfection, mental exhaustion, and the feeling of being misunderstood existed in silence. This is a profoundly deep lesson, especially for American society, where success is often measured by visibility, fame, and hero moments. Xavi shows that there are people who don't stand in the spotlight, but keep entire systems running like the quiet workers, educators, engineers, or frontline staff in American life. This story reminds us that true value isn't always in being seen, but in how we contribute to the community and systems around us. At the same time, it's also a warning. If society only celebrates surface-level moments and forgets silent contributions, we may miss the most important people. If the story of a great but quiet man like Xavi Hernandez makes you reflect, please hit subscribe and leave a heart emoji to honor the values that aren't always visible. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video where we'll continue exploring the stories the world may have missed.